House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's planned visit to Taiwan in August is causing diplomatic tension between the U.S. and Communist China, with the Chinese government suggesting a military response should she go ahead with the visit. What exactly is meant by a military response, and should the U.S. allow China's threats to dictate its foreign policy? Joining me to discuss this and much more, President of the Population Research Institute, author of the new book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics, Stephen Mosher. Stephen, thanks for being here. Before we get to the book, I have to start with this Pelosi visit to Taiwan. The Guardian has confirmed her trip in August, despite pushback from our own state and defense departments. On Tuesday, a spokesman for China's Ministry of Defense said regarding Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, if Pelosi visits Taiwan, it would seriously violate the One China principle and seriously harm China's sovereignty and territorial integrity and seriously damage the political foundation of the China-U.S. relationship. Beijing urges the U.S. to take practical actions to uphold its commitment to avoid supporting Taiwan's independence and must not arrange for Pelosi to visit the Taiwan region. If the U.S. insists on taking its own course, the Chinese military will never sit idly by, and it will definitely take strong actions to thwart any external forces' interference. Stephen, your thoughts on China's response here to this trip?
Well, I think that the Chinese Communist Party's actions have seriously harmed U.S. relations for a long, long time. The espionage, the theft of intellectual property, the currency manipulation. And more recently, of course, we have the claim that China owns the entire South China Sea. We have aggressive actions towards Japanese ships, including ramming a Japanese naval vessel a couple of years ago. This is gray zone warfare. And what that means is that they're pushing the envelope. They're trying to see how far they can get us to move back, to give way, to concede control over Taiwan to them without going kinetic. And the thing about a bully is whether it's a schoolyard bully or an international bully like China, you don't kowtow to the bully, because the next time they will simply demand that you bow lower and concede more. I think since President Trump was elected in 2016, there have been a whole series of senior government officials who have gone to Taiwan. That practice should continue. In fact, I would argue that we need to extend diplomatic recognition to Taiwan now as an independent country, and not do it in isolation. Do it in conjunction with Japan and Australia and our NATO allies, and present a united front against this new Chinese aggression. Because remember what's happening in Tibet right now, what's happening in Xinjiang right now to the Uyghurs, what's happening in Hong Kong right now to that once great free city. This will never end. It won't end with Taiwan. It will continue after that as China spreads its errors around the world.
Stephen, even Biden is suggesting that Pelosi not go to Taiwan. Now, she would be the highest-ranking U.S. official since Newt Gingrich back in the 90s to visit the island nation. Pelosi doesn't seem to be backing down, however. Listen.
I think that it's important for us to show support for Taiwan. I also think that none of us has ever said we're for independence when it comes to Taiwan. That's up to Taiwan to decide.
Your reaction, Steve?
Well, I would be happy if Nancy Pelosi were to go to Taiwan in conjunction with several other senior U.S. officials. When you talk about harming relations, no nation of the two has harmed relations more than China in releasing a pandemic upon the world. And I have to say, this administration has been absolutely silent in demanding compensation from China, in demanding reparations from China, in demanding accountability from China. And that ought to be the focus of our China policy right now, is getting to the bottom of the pandemic and making China pay for the millions of lives lost and the trillions of dollars in economic damage.
Stephen, President Biden spoke with China for 2 hours earlier today via Zoom. Now, Xi reiterated his opposition to Taiwanese independence, and in the printout from the Chinese government, and who knows if you can believe that, it says that Biden agreed to this one China policy. Was anything achieved here today, do you think?
Well, the one child China policy, not the one child policy, which I often talk about as well, which is China's one child policy, but the one China policy didn't specify which China would be in charge. And so the one China policy originally was vague in that sense. So we've never actually conceded that the Chinese Communist Party should directly rule Taiwan. We've just acknowledged that eventually there may be one China. But in my view, unless the people of Taiwan democratically vote to join the People's Republic of China, which is about as unlikely as you can imagine, that should never happen.
Next month, the CCP will hold its 20th Congress. Now, this is a major gathering. It occurs every 5 years or so. This time, President Xi is expected to take an unprecedented third term on as president. Now, no doubt Taiwan's going to be a focus here now that Hong Kong has been dominated. What do you expect China will decide regarding Taiwan at this Congress, if anything?
Well, I think China, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, will decide that that President Xi Jinping deserves a third term because he's purged and punished all of the people who might stand in the way of that. The last center of resistance was Shanghai. And what did he do to Shanghai? He locked down the 26 million people of Shanghai for several months on the grounds of COVID, showing the people of Shanghai who was actually in charge. So Xi Jinping would like to bring Taiwan back under the control of the party, to be sure. He promised to do it by 2020, Raymond. That's a couple years in the rearview mirror right now. And so he's moving forward, I think, on many fronts to build up his military, to try to undermine Taiwan from within. But I have to tell you that opinion polls show that nearly 80% of the people of Taiwan, 24.5 million people strong, would take up arms against an invading force from mainland China. So public opinion in Taiwan is unanimously almost in favor of continuing the present relationship where they are a free country, free and independent for all practical purposes. They have regular democratic elections, a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another. They enjoy human rights and freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, all those freedoms which we too hold dear. They don't want to lose that to a Communist Party dictatorship.
Well, Stephen, I hear all of that. I watch that. I listen closely to the silence, as you mentioned a moment ago, from the Biden administration. And I keep thinking Hong Kong had all of those features you just ran down as well. And look where they are today. So the United States has to decide what it's willing to do vis-a-vis Taiwan. And is it going to go the way of Hong Kong? We'll see. A report released on Tuesday by the Republican staff of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee found that for a decade, Fed employees were offered contracts with Chinese talent recruitment programs, which often included cash payments and asked to provide information on the U.S. economy, interest rate changes, and policies. In a statement, the committee's ranking Republican Senator Rob Portman of Ohio said this: "This investigation makes clear that China's malign efforts at influence and information theft are not limited to science and the technology fields. American economic and monetary policy is also being targeted by the Chinese government." Now, Steve, the report doesn't say whether any sensitive information was compromised, and Fed Chairman Jerome Powell strongly disputed the report's findings. He called the characterizations of some employees unfair. Are you surprised at all that China would target the Fed, and how worrisome is this report to you?
No, the Chinese espionage effort in the United States is really much like a giant vacuum cleaner, just vacuuming up information, data from all sources. And they're willing to use drugs, they're willing to use prostitutes, and they're willing to use money to achieve those ends. In fact, we have a video of a senior Communist Party official laughing along with an audience which laughed with him about how easy it was to corrupt American officials. He said, if you offer one bag of money, and if one bag of money isn't enough, you offer two, and you can go to three. So this sort of corruption is spread by the Communist Party, which is an international terrorist organization, in my view, an organized criminal conspiracy whose first victims, of course, are the Chinese people, but is eager to spread its writ to larger areas of the world. And as I say, they won't stop with Taiwan. They want to control wider swaths of the planet, ultimately seeking global control.
Well, I want to move on to your book, which touches on all of this. It's called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics. And you assert there's mounting evidence that leads to the fact that COVID-19 was released from a lab in Wuhan, China. What role do you believe the Chinese Communist Party had in the release of this virus, and why, Steve?
Well, here's a very interesting question, which I'm often asked. Did the virus leak from the lab, or was it deliberately released? And the answer is both. And how that works is follows, Raymond. They were working on a bioweapon called the coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. And during the course of that research, they had the virus in the test tube ready to go. What they needed was a vaccine to vaccinate their own people, because you don't want to release a bioweapon on your own population. And so I believe the evidence shows that the virus leaked out during vaccine trials in Wuhan. In other words, they were using an attenuated vaccine, a weakened version of the real virus, attenuated vaccine. And sometimes when you use that sort of vaccine, you can actually contract the disease itself. So I believe they inadvertently allowed this bioweapon to leak out of the lab and caused an epidemic on their own people. Then what did they do? They deliberately grounded the planes in Wuhan from flying to Shanghai and Shandong and Beijing and Guangdong, but they allowed planes to go to Milan, New York City, Madrid, Spain, other hotspots. They turned out to be hotspots of the coronavirus. So you see, it leaked from the lab during vaccine trials, but it was deliberately spread around the world as a pandemic in the weeks thereafter. And I say that in part not only because of the evidence about this epidemic, this pandemic, but this is a pattern of behavior on the part of the Chinese Communist Party. In 58,
well, you write about this. You write about this in the book. The Asian flu in 57, the Hong Kong flu in 68, SARS in 2003, and on and on. Most recently, COVID-19. You write that COVID's not the last virus you see coming from China. Why do you say that?
Well, I say that because the Communist Party has had an active bioweapons program since taking power in 1950. Sadly, during the Japanese invasion of China, the Japanese actually used bioweapons against the Chinese population, anthrax mostly, bubonic plague partially. And those facilities were taken over by the Communist Party when it took power. But things moved to a new level after 2000, when it became possible to manipulate genomes, and it also became possible to send your scientists to the United States, to labs that were funded by Dr. Anthony Fauci, where they could learn gain-of-function research to make viruses more infectious and lethal, and then take that technology back to China. And then it also became possible, and this is, I think, Dr. Anthony Fauci's original pandemic sin. The original sin of Dr. Fauci was promoting this gain-of-function research, and then once it was banned in the United States in 2017, he took his gain-of-function research to labs around the world, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was working on coronaviruses. There's a whole paper trail going back over 10 years of how they were enhancing the infectiousness and lethality of coronaviruses. There are people like Richard Ebright of EcoHealth Alliance, who is getting funding from Dr. Anthony Fauci's shop, talking about, in November of 2019, of all times, talking about how successful the Wuhan Institute of Virology was in genetically engineering coronaviruses using gain-of-function research, and how they were able to infect mice, humanized mice, showing that they could infect human beings. So all of this is on the record. There's no point in denying that it came from the lab. There's no point in denying, as Dr. Fauci has, that money was going indirectly from the National Institute of Health through EcoHealth Alliance to the Wuhan lab. There's no point denying that the head of the lab, Dr. Shi Zhongli, was trained in the United States at labs that he funded. So we basically handed over to the Chinese Communist Party's bioweapons experts the ability to make a bioweapon. And surprise, surprise, that's exactly what they did.
In the book, you point out that pandemics not only kill people, they hurt and can potentially destroy economies, destabilize countries. And you go on to write about the liberties lost during the COVID shutdowns. Quote, those who violated the quarantine had the full weight of the law dropped upon them. But the real vitriol was reserved for those who dared to come out and protest the Fauci-inspired lockdowns in places such as New York, California, Virginia, and Michigan. These crowds of normal Americans who simply wanted to get on with their lives were attacked as racists, fascists, and extremists. How much damage was done by Fauci and the CDC regarding misinforming the public about COVID-19 and who was really affected, and the promotion of these lockdowns?
Oh, I mean, tens of trillions of dollars in economic damage to the United States and, of course, to the world economy. And as I would argue, it was done deliberately. This was probably the most successful weapon in release in human history. Millions of people have died, tens of trillions of dollars in economic damage, and the Biden administration appears incapable of trying to call China to account for that. I was pleased the other day. We had President Trump down in Tampa giving a speech, and he mentioned as one of the articles that he would pursue in the future was setting up a commission to have accountability for China for the release of the coronavirus on the world. We need leaders in the United States to be calling China to account, because if they're not called to account, I'm afraid that lurking in a test tube somewhere, perhaps in the Wuhan Institute of Virology itself, is another coronavirus, another virus of a different kind that will be released at the appropriate time. And I ask myself, why wouldn't they release it? The last release was successful. It caused damage to their principal adversary, their principal enemy, they regard us, and there have been no consequences, no reparations paid, no damages demanded from China by the United States. Why wouldn't they do it again? Are there any ethical or moral constraints that would prevent the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, who've killed tens of millions of their own people, from doing this again to the world? I think not.
In a recent interview on Fox, Dr. Deborah Birx, the former COVID response coordinator, she was asked what people who have not been vaccinated should be thinking when they see President Biden and others who have been vaccinated and boosted getting COVID.
Well, if you're across the South and you're in the middle of this wave, what's going to save you right now is Paxlovid. I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection, and I think we overplayed the vaccines.
We overplayed the vaccines. What do you make of that admission?
Well, I make of that admission that she and Anthony Fauci are not going to be on very good terms from now on, because Dr. Anthony Fauci not only was obsessed with gain-of-function research, and we know how that turned out with the creation of the coronavirus in the lab, but he was also obsessed with using mRNA vaccines to trick the body into making parts of viruses that would then produce an immune response, hopefully against a particular disease. He's been trying that now for 25 years. And he's never succeeded. And in my view, he didn't succeed in this time. I think that and it is very interesting to me, Raymond, that China does not allow the use of the mRNA vaccines. They are using a traditional attenuated vaccine. What do they know that we don't know? What we do know, of course, is that Big Pharma has made $100 billion off guaranteed government contracts and have been indemnified from lawsuits. So if you suffer an adverse medical effect, you can't seek damages from the company that produced the drug.
Yeah, and they sat on top of the Novavax vaccine, which we paid for. The Trump administration gave them $1 billion to come up with a vaccine. The FDA sat on it and didn't approve it for use until earlier this year. On Saturday, the World Health Organization declared monkeypox a global public health emergency, Steve. Dr. Tedros, the Director General, overruled a panel of advisors who could not come to a consensus. Now, according to the WHO, they only classify COVID-19 and polio this way as a public health emergency of international concern. Now, monkeypox has been a concern for years in African countries, but in recent weeks, the virus has spread worldwide to some 75 countries. There are about 16,000 cases. Nearly all those infections outside Africa have occurred among men who have sex with other men. What do you make of the WHO monkeypox declaration, Steve? And where is this leading?
Dr. Tedros is overriding his own advisory commission, which has probably between the couple dozen advisors, a couple hundred years of experience in pandemics and viruses. He's not even a medical doctor. And then, of course, his statement today was that perhaps men who have sex with men ought to temporarily reconsider their sexual practices. Look, that strikes me as rather an underreaction, given the fact that in response to the coronavirus, we were all subject to lockdown for weeks on end. Our churches were closed. Businesses were shuttered. Pastors were arrested for trying to open their doors and minister to the people who came to them for help. And yet, what we hear now is that people should perhaps reconsider their sex life. I'm reminded of a statement that Father Paul Marx used to make. He said, "No one ever died of sex." Perhaps it would be best if people spoke honestly and openly about the fact that the way to stop monkeypox is the way to stop having indulging your sexual appetites at the present time.
What do you hope people get from your politically incorrect guide to pandemics? Why did you write this book now?
I wrote the book because, first of all, China is the great breeding ground of pandemics, and that the Chinese Communist Party has now 4 times released a pandemic on the world, tried to release a pandemic on the world, and they will do it again, especially if there are no repercussions for the last release. Secondly, people need to know that we're still living with the aftermath of the Spanish flu, which killed 40 or 50 million people in 1918, 1919. It's known as the mother of all pandemics because we're still dealing with the variants every winter flu season, but we don't die in large numbers. So basic evolutionary biology tells you that the coronavirus is evolving into less lethal, less dangerous forms. So let's all calm down about this. Fauci is going to talk about a wave this fall. Omicron should be pronounced I'm a cold. Protect yourself, take reasonable precautions, but this is not a viral Armageddon.
The Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics by Stephen Mosher is available now at bookstores everywhere and online. Stephen, thank you for being here.
Thank you.